The year is 1990, and the air across Eastern Europe feels heavy with uncertainty. The Soviet Union has collapsed, leaving behind fractured institutions, economic turmoil, and a police system stretched thin. In Ukraine, nights that should have been ordinary became shrouded in silence, a silence broken not by storms or accidents, but by something far more unsettling. Picture a quiet village road, the faint glow of lamps flickering through curtained windows. Families asleep, unaware that their homes would soon become places investigators could barely comprehend. Doors left ajar, rooms frozen in eerie stillness, and a trail of devastation so profound that even seasoned officers struggled to process what they were seeing. It was in this fragile landscape that a man named Anatoly Onoprienko moved almost invisibly. To neighbors, he seemed unremarkable. A forestry worker, a sailor, someone simply trying to survive the chaos of the post-Soviet years. Yet beneath that exterior, something darker was taking shape. What makes this story even more haunting is how long he remained unnoticed. Entire families vanished, yet the incidents were often treated as isolated tragedies. Investigators, overwhelmed and under-resourced, failed to connect the dots. It was only later that they realized a single figure had been walking from town to town, leaving behind devastation that defied explanation. Onoprienko once claimed that his actions were guided by a higher purpose, hinting at secret societies and forces beyond himself. Whether this was delusion, manipulation, or something else entirely, it left interrogators stunned. Imagine the tension of those years. Communities locking their doors, parents whispering warnings to children, and yet still feeling that invisible shadow pressing in. The fear was not just of what had happened, but of what could happen next. This is not simply a case about one man. It is a portrait of a nation caught in transition, where fragility allowed darkness to thrive. And as we step deeper into this story, the question lingers. How could someone walk so freely through ordinary streets, leaving behind extraordinary devastation, without being stopped sooner? If stories like this captivate you, stay with us. Because what begins as a whisper in the night soon unfolds into one of the most unsettling investigations Europe has ever faced. 1959, a small village in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. A boy is born into a world that will never truly feel like home. His name is Anatoly Onoprienko, and long before his name would echo through the darkest corners of criminal history, his story begins not with violence, but with loss. The kind of loss that reshapes everything. He's just a child when his mother dies. The woman who brought him into this world vanishes from it, leaving behind a father overwhelmed by grief and two young boys who need him. But the father cannot cope. The weight is too much, the resources too few. And so he makes a decision that will haunt one of those boys forever. He separates them. The older brother stays with relatives, a warm home, family meals, the comfort of familiar faces. But Anatoly is sent away to a state-run institution, cold, impersonal, a place where children are kept, not raised, where survival matters more than love. Imagine that moment, being a child and watching your brother stay while you're taken away, knowing that somehow, in some way you can't understand, you were the one not chosen. Those who knew him during those years would later describe a boy who seemed to retreat into himself, emotionally distant, withdrawn, a child learning to live without attachment because attachment had only ever meant abandonment. The walls of the institution become his world, other forgotten children his only companions. Affection is scarce, stability almost non-existent, and deep inside, a question begins to form, silent but persistent. Why was I the one left behind? Years pass. Anatoly grows into a young man. He serves in the Soviet army, following orders, blending in. Later, he works as a sailor, then in forestry, taking whatever jobs he can find. From the outside, he looks like countless others trying to navigate the collapse of the Soviet system. Just another man attempting to build something from nothing. But here's what most people don't know. During this time, Anatoly tried repeatedly to reconnect with his brother. Not just once, but multiple times, and each time he was refused, turned away. The rejection from childhood replayed again and again in adulthood. On the surface, life continues. He moves from place to place, works odd jobs, maintains a facade of normalcy. But beneath that surface, something else is happening. Something is accumulating, festering, growing in the silence of unresolved pain and decades of feeling unwanted. Friends and acquaintances see a quiet man, perhaps a bit strange, perhaps a bit cold, but nothing alarming, nothing that suggests what's brewing beneath. Because trauma doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And then, one day, that wait comes to an end. What happens next will shock an entire nation and leave investigators struggling to understand how a man who seemed so ordinary could become connected to something so extraordinary. But to understand that transformation, you have to start here, in this village, with this abandoned boy, with this one devastating choice that set everything in motion. The question isn't just what Anatoly Onoprienko became. The question is, what do we become when the world teaches us we don't belong in it? Late 1980s. The Soviet Union is crumbling. Borders are porous. Record-keeping is chaotic. And in this moment of historical collapse, Anatoly Onoprienko begins to cross a line from which there is no return. At first, it looks like simple criminality. He teams up with an accomplice. The plan seems straightforward enough. Break into homes, steal money, valuables, weapons, quick jobs, easy targets. But something shifts. Something dark. The violence, which should have been just a tool, becomes something else entirely. It becomes the point. 1989. A family is discovered in their home. All of them gone. Days later, another family. Then another. And investigators begin to notice something that makes their blood run cold. A pattern. The residences are always isolated, tucked away from main roads, far from neighbors who might hear, far from anyone who might help. And here's what's chilling. These aren't random strikes. Someone is watching, observing routines, studying when people come and go, noting when children return from school, when fathers come home from work, when the entire family is together, vulnerable, behind locked doors that won't protect them. Then, when the moment is right, the door opens, and everything changes. What happens inside these homes defies comprehension. It's not just about witnesses. It's not strategic. Children are taken, parents, grandparents, anyone who happens to be present. The scope of it suggests something beyond robbery, beyond even raid. It suggests something methodical. After each incident, belongings vanish. Jewelry, cash, sometimes weapons. But then comes the fire. Flames consume the scene. Wood crackles. Wallpaper peels and blackens. The heat destroys evidence, confuses timelines, and leaves investigators with little more than ashes and questions. Here's what most people don't realize. During this period, Anatoly wasn't just covering his tracks with fire. He was keeping souvenirs, personal items from the families, photographs, small mementos, objects that had no monetary value but held something else, something psychological. He would later describe feeling a rush of power each time he looked at them. A reminder that he had controlled life and death itself. But back then, in those chaotic final years of the Soviet era, law enforcement is struggling. Different regions, different jurisdictions, no central database connecting cases across territories. Many investigators treat each incident as isolated. A terrible tragedy, yes, but separate, unconnected. They don't yet see what's actually happening. They don't realize that someone is moving. City to city, region to region, like a shadow passing through the fractured landscape of a dying empire. Someone who has learned that in chaos, you can disappear, that in a world falling apart, nobody's watching closely enough. The fires continue, the incidents multiply, and still, no alarm bells ring at the national level. But here's the thing about patterns. Eventually, someone notices. Eventually, the dots connect. And what would emerge in the years to come would reveal something far more extensive than anyone imagined. Something that would force an entire nation to confront a terrifying question. How many families had already vanished before anyone realized they were hunting for one person? The answer would come, but not yet, because the first cycle, devastating as it was would turn out to be just the beginning, a rehearsal for something far worse. And when Anatoly finally paused his activities, it wasn't because he was caught. It wasn't because he felt remorse. He simply stopped, went quiet, disappeared into ordinary life. For 6 years, nothing. Silence. As if it had all been a nightmare that ended. But nightmares don't end. They just wait. And what was waiting in the shadows of the mid-90s would eclipse everything that came before. The question isn't whether he would return. The question is, what was he becoming during those silent years? 1995. 6 years have passed since the first cycle ended. 6 years of silence. And then, like a storm that's been gathering strength over the horizon, it returns. But this time, everything is different. Anatoly is no longer working with an accomplice. No partner to share the risk. No one to witness what he does. He's alone now. And somehow, that makes him more dangerous. The methodology becomes surgical. He travels vast distances across Ukraine, hundreds of kilometers between strikes. He studies rural regions where homes sit far from main roads, where the nearest neighbor might be a kilometer away, where screams dissolve into empty fields and no one hears. He watches. He learns routines. He notes which houses have dogs and which don't, which families have teenagers who stay up late, which have small children who sleep early. And then he waits for night. Darkness falls. A family sits down for dinner. Parents talk about work. Children finish homework. The television plays in the background. Ordinary evening sound. The clink of dishes. Laughter. The mundane comfort of home. And then the door opens. What police discover in the aftermath is almost unbearable. Couples found together. Children in their own bedrooms, surrounded by toys and school books. Houses that just hours before hummed with life, now frozen in terrible silence. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. The items taken often make no sense. Sometimes just a few coins, a cheap watch, objects with barely any resale value. And this is what truly terrifies investigators. Because if it's not about money, then what is it about? The realization hits like ice water. This isn't crime for profit. This is something else. Something about complete annihilation. The total erasure of families, not just taking lives but destroying entire worlds. The parents who would never see their children grow up. The children who would never become anything. Futures deleted in a single night. Here's what most people don't know. Anatoly carried a specific weapon during this period, a sawed-off shotgun that he'd customized himself, but he also brought other tools. Multiple weapons for different purposes. And investigators would later realize he planned for every contingency. If someone fought back, if someone ran, if a door was reinforced. He had thought through every scenario with chilling precision. Within months, the numbers climb rapidly. 8 people in one region, 12 in another, then more. The incidents spread across different areas, making it harder to connect them initially. But eventually, patterns emerge. The rural locations, the nighttime timing, the complete devastation left behind. In small villages across Ukraine, life changes. People who never locked their doors now barricade them. Fathers sit up through the night, rifles across their laps, jumping at every sound. Dogs bark at shadows. Children are kept home from evening activities. In some towns, families pack into single homes, afraid to be alone. The fear is palpable. You can feel it in the empty streets after sunset, in the way people avoid eye contact, as if speaking about it might summon it, in the whispered conversations that stop when strangers approach. Because this isn't just about what's happened, it's about what might happen next, which family might be chosen, which home might be marked, who will hear that sound at their door tonight. The media begins using a term that captures the horror, the Terminator. Not a person, not even a criminal. Something that sounds mechanical, unstoppable, inhuman. And across Ukraine, a nation holds its breath. Police work around the clock. Task forces form. Roadblocks appear on rural highways. Officers patrol remote areas. But how do you catch someone who strikes without pattern? Who travels vast distances between incidents? Who chooses victims seemingly at random? The truth is, they can't. Not yet. But what happens next will change everything. Because someone is about to make a mistake, a small one, The kind that seems insignificant in the moment but unravels everything. And when that thread is pulled, what comes loose will reveal not just a man, but a mind. A psychology so disturbing that even experienced investigators will struggle to comprehend it. The manhunt is about to reach its conclusion. But the real horror? That's just beginning to emerge. 1990s Ukraine, a nation in transition. The Soviet infrastructure has collapsed. What remains is fractured, underfunded, barely functional. And in this chaos, someone is hunting. Picture the scene. Police stations across different regions, each dealing with their own nightmare. Files stacked on desks, telephones that sometimes work, sometimes don't. Officers exhausted, overwhelmed, working cases that seem impossible to solve. Here's the problem. They have no central database, no way to cross-reference cases from one oblast to another. When an incident happens in Lviv, investigators in Kiev don't automatically know about it. When families disappear in small villages hundreds of kilometers apart, there's no system connecting the dots. Each local department treats what they're seeing as an isolated tragedy. A terrible crime, yes, but theirs alone to solve. This fragmentation is exactly what keeps Anatoly invisible. He moves like smoke between jurisdictions, strikes in one region, then vanishes. Weeks later, he's 500 kilometers away. By the time local police have processed one scene, he's already selecting his next target in a completely different area. The communication gaps are staggering. In some cases, it takes weeks for reports to reach regional headquarters. In others, crucial details are lost in translation between departments. One investigator notices a pattern with a specific weapon type. Another, 300 kilometers away, has noted the same thing, but they never speak to each other. Resources are painfully limited. Forensic technology that Western police take for granted simply doesn't exist here. DNA analysis is rudimentary at best. Fingerprint databases are incomplete. Crime scene processing is basic. And then there's the fire. Always the fire. Scene after scene reduced to ash and char. Evidence that might have connected the cases literally goes up in smoke. Survivors? Almost non-existent. Anatoly's approach ensures there are rarely witnesses left to describe him. And when there are, they're often children, traumatized, their testimonies fragmented by shock. Here's what most people don't realize. During this entire period, Anatoly was stopped by police multiple times. Routine traffic checks, random document inspections, the kind of encounters that happen on Ukrainian roads every day. And every single time he talked his way through. His papers were in order, his demeanor calm, his vehicle unremarkable. Officers would wave him on, never knowing they'd just let the most wanted man in Ukraine drive away. But as the body count rises, something shifts. The pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Families are demanding answers. Media coverage intensifies. Politicians need results. And finally, resources begin flowing to a centralized task force. Investigators from different regions are brought together. Files that sat isolated in local stations are compiled into one room. And when they lay everything out, when they pin maps to walls and connect incidents with string, a picture emerges that makes their blood run cold. The scope of it, the sheer scale. They're not dealing with multiple criminals. They're dealing with one person, one man who has been crossing their country for years, leaving devastation in his wake. Patterns become clear. Rural homes, nighttime entries, families targeted, the use of specific weapons, the fires. It's all there, suddenly visible when the fragments come together. They begin plotting his movements, calculating distances between incidents, analyzing timelines, and they realize he's not just moving randomly. He's following roads, specific routes through the countryside, areas where police presence is thin, where he can observe without being noticed. A profile begins to form. They're looking for someone with mobility, access to vehicles, someone who knows rural Ukraine intimately, someone who understands police procedures well enough to avoid them. But knowing all this and actually finding him are two entirely different things, because Ukraine is vast. 46,000 square kilometers of countryside, endless small roads, countless villages. How do you find one man in all that space? If you're captivated by how this investigation unfolds, show your support. It helps us continue bringing you these deep investigations into cases that changed history. The task force sets up roadblocks, increases patrols, distributes descriptions to every station in the country. Officers are told to check vehicles more thoroughly, to trust their instincts, to look for anything unusual. And then, in March of 1996, something breaks. It's small, almost nothing. The kind of detail that could easily be missed. An officer stops a car. Routine check. The man inside is calm, papers in order. But something feels off. The officer can't quite place it. Just an instinct, a hesitation. He looks closer, notices mud on the tires, a specific type, fresh, and in the back seat, partially covered, some items that seem out of place. Nothing obviously stolen, nothing that screams criminal, just wrong somehow. The officer makes a choice. Instead of waving the car through, he asks the man to step out, to open the trunk, and in that moment, everything changes. Because what they find in that car will unlock the entire case, will reveal not just evidence, but a collection, an archive of horror that will take investigators months to fully process. The most wanted man in Ukraine has just been caught because of mud on tires and a policeman's instinct. But catching him is only the beginning, because what comes next, what emerges in interrogation rooms over the following weeks, will be somehow worse than anyone imagined. The man himself has a story to tell, and he's ready to talk. March 1996. A roadside checkpoint in central Ukraine. An officer waves down a car. Routine procedure. Happens 1,000 times a day across the country. But this time, something is different. The driver is calm. Too calm, perhaps. His documents are in order. Registration valid. Nothing obviously wrong. But the officer has that feeling. The one you can't explain. The one that makes you look twice. He asks the driver to open the trunk. And when it opens, the world shifts. Inside, personal items that don't belong to him. Jewelry, photographs, a watch with an inscription. Things that have no business being in this car. And weapons, multiple firearms, including one that's been customized, modified in a very specific way. The officer's training kicks in. He calls for backup. Within hours, Anatoly Onoprienko is in custody, and investigators begin the process of searching everything connected to him. What they find turns their stomachs. His residence becomes a crime scene itself. In drawers, in closets, hidden in corners, they discover a collection. Dozens of items traced back to victims. Wedding rings with inscriptions matching missing persons reports. Children's toys. Identification documents. Each object a life. Each one a family that no longer exists. But here's what truly disturbs them. The organization. These aren't items thrown together carelessly. They're arranged, cataloged, like trophies on a shelf, like someone maintaining a personal museum. The weapons match ballistic evidence from multiple scenes. The timeline of his movements aligns with incident dates. Every piece of evidence points the same direction. They have him. After years of terror, they finally have him. In the interrogation room, investigators expect denials. Lawyers. Silence. That's what usually happens with cases this serious. Instead, something unexpected occurs. Anatoly starts talking, not reluctantly, not under extreme pressure. He simply begins to confess. One case after another. Locations. Dates. Details only the person responsible could know. The investigators sit across from him, taking notes, barely believing what they're hearing. The number of victims climbs. 8, 15, 25, 30. It keeps rising. Each confession verified against open cases. Each detail checking out against evidence. But what truly chills everyone in that room isn't the scope. It's the delivery. He speaks without emotion. His voice flat, clinical. As if he's describing something he observed rather than something he did. There's no trembling, no tears, no breakdown. He recalls events with the same tone someone might use to describe their morning commute. Here's what most people never learn. During these interrogations, Anatoly didn't just confess to the incidents. He explained his reasoning, and what he said revealed something deeply disturbing about his psychology. He claimed he was on a mission, that he saw himself as chosen. that ordinary people living ordinary lives somehow offended him by their very existence. Their happiness, their families, their normal contentment represented everything he'd been denied, and so he decided to take it from them. Psychologists brought in to evaluate him note something rare, a complete absence of empathy. When asked about the children, he shows no emotion. When confronted with photographs of families, nothing registers in his expression. It's as if he's looking at objects, not people. One investigator later recalls asking him if he ever felt anything during the incidents. Anatoly paused, considered the question, then said something that would haunt that investigator for the rest of his career. He said he felt powerful, in control, like God deciding who lived and who didn't. The confessions continue for days. Investigators cross-reference everything, travel to scenes, verify details, and every single thing he says proves accurate. He's not exaggerating, he's not confabulating, he's simply recounting what he did. The final count shocks the nation. 52 confirmed victims, possibly more. Men, women, children, entire families erased. The number makes him one of the most prolific criminals in European history. But numbers barely capture the reality. Behind each number is a name, a life, a future that never happened. News spreads across Ukraine. The Terminator has been caught. The nightmare is over. People in rural villages breathe relief for the first time in years. Doors unlock. Children play outside again. Life begins to return to normal. But for the families of the victims, there is no relief, only confirmation. The worst possibilities now concrete facts. The loved ones who disappeared now accounted for. The hope that maybe, somehow, they'd survived, now extinguished. Anatoly sits in his cell, awaiting trial. And investigators prepare their case, knowing the world will be watching. Because this isn't just about one man. It's about understanding how someone becomes capable of such acts. About examining the failures that let it continue so long. About ensuring it never happens again. But here's the question that haunts everyone involved. Was he always this way? Or did something turn him into this? Was it the abandoned child from the institution? The rejected brother? The accumulated years of resentment? Or was there something else? Something darker that existed long before the abandonment? Something that would have emerged regardless of his circumstances? The trial will attempt to answer these questions. Psychiatrists will testify. Evidence will be presented. The nation will try to understand. But some things perhaps are beyond understanding. Some darkness exists in places psychology can't fully illuminate. And as Anatoly awaits his judgment, one thing becomes clear. Catching him was only the end of the manhunt. Understanding him? That might be impossible. The courtroom fell silent as the numbers began to surface. One by one, they appeared in the testimonies, in the evidence files, in the confessions that seemed to never end. 52 live. 52 names that would never answer to roll call again. It was the spring of 1999, and Ukraine was finally confronting a nightmare it hadn't fully understood. The man sitting behind the defendant's glass cage showed no trembling hands, no tears, no visible remorse. Anatoly Onoprienko spoke with an unsettling calmness about what he had done across the countryside between 1995 and 1996. But these weren't just numbers on a courtroom document. They were families, entire households that had simply vanished from existence. In some villages, neighbors would walk past empty homes for months, assuming the occupants had moved away for work or relocated to the city. The truth was far darker. In certain houses, there was no one left alive to tell what had happened on those winter nights when the snow muffled every sound. Psychologists and criminal experts filled the courtroom galleries, trying to decode the mind before them. They spoke of early childhood abandonment, when young Anatoly had been given up by his family and raised in state institutions. They analyzed his years of emotional isolation, the resentment that calcified in his chest like a stone, the possible neurological disturbances that might explain, though never justify, his actions. Yet here's what startled even the veteran investigators. Onoprienko had lived among ordinary people for years, holding jobs, maintaining relationships, appearing utterly unremarkable. Some who knew him described him as quiet, even polite. The mask he wore was so convincing that he moved through society like a shadow, never raising alarm until it was far too late. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It transformed into a mirror held up to a country still reeling from post-Soviet collapse. The police systems that had failed to connect the dots, the communication breakdowns between regional departments, the social fabric that had frayed so badly that vulnerable communities stood exposed with almost no protection. One prosecutor would later recall the heavy silence that filled the courtroom each day. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of collective grief, of a nation processing trauma it hadn't known how to name. This wasn't merely about one individual's capacity for violence. It was about the institutional cracks through which so many had fallen. As the trial progressed, the scale of devastation crystallized. Entire family trees had been severed, children who would never grow up, parents who would never see another sunrise. The courtroom became a repository of stolen futures, each testimony adding another layer to an almost incomprehensible tragedy. What emerged was a portrait of systemic vulnerability meeting calculated brutality. Ukraine was forced to reckon not just with the actions of one person, but with the fragility of its protective systems during a period of profound transition and chaos. The verdict, when it finally came, carried the weight of those 52 names. But it also carried something else, a scar on the national consciousness that would never fully heal. A reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it walks quietly among us, wearing the face of normalcy, waiting for the moment when the structures meant to protect us looked the other way. And in that realization lay perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. The arrests brought an end to the violence. The courtroom doors closed. The defendant was led away. But in the villages scattered across the Ukrainian countryside, something remained behind. Something that couldn't be locked away or sentenced or put neatly into evidence boxes. Fear doesn't disappear just because the source of it has been removed. Years after Anatoly Onoprienko's capture, families still checked their door locks twice before bed. Children who had been too young to remember the incidents directly grew up hearing whispered stories from their parents, absorbing a second-hand trauma that somehow felt immediate. Neighbors who had once left their homes unlocked during harvest season now installed metal doors and exterior lights that burned through the night. In one village, an elderly woman admitted to journalists that she hadn't slept through a full night in over 5 years. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, every distant sound of a car engine cutting through the rural darkness. Her body remained on high alert, even though her mind knew the threat had passed. This was the invisible inheritance of those years between 1995 and 1996, a psychological scar tissue that formed over entire communities, changing the way people moved through the world. But perhaps more disturbing than the personal trauma was what the case revealed about the systems meant to protect ordinary citizens. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, a troubling pattern emerged. Different police departments had been investigating similar incidents across various regions, yet no one had connected the dots. Evidence from one jurisdiction never made it to another. Witness descriptions sat in filing cabinets, never cross-referenced. Communication breakdowns that, in retrospect, seemed almost incomprehensible. Here's what few people know. After this case concluded, Ukraine completely restructured its approach to major criminal investigations. A centralized database was created. Training protocols were rewritten. Regional departments established direct communication channels that bypassed bureaucratic red tape. The tragedy became a catalyst for systemic change, though the price of that lesson remained heartbreakingly high. Criminologists from across Europe studied the case files, trying to understand how someone could operate undetected for so long across such a wide geographic area. The answer they found was uncomfortable. It wasn't just about one individual's ability to evade detection. It was about fractured institutions during a period of national transition, about communities too isolated to share information effectively, about the chaos of post-Soviet restructuring, leaving gaps through which danger could slip unnoticed. Even now, more than 2 decades later, Anatoly Onoprienko's name appears in criminology textbooks and law enforcement training materials, not as a sensational story, but as a case study in systemic failure and the importance of interagency cooperation. Students in police academies examine the timeline, identifying the moments when intervention might have been possible, studying the missed opportunities that haunt investigators to this day. The physical evidence has been archived. The trial transcripts have been filed away. But in certain villages, if you visit during winter when darkness falls early, you can still feel the residue of those years. It's in the way people glance over their shoulders, in the exterior lights that never seem to go off, in the unspoken agreement that some topics remain too painful to discuss openly, because the most chilling realization wasn't just about what happened. It was about how long it went unrecognized, how many opportunities existed to stop the pattern before it claimed 52 lives, how the signs were there, scattered across different desks in different offices, waiting for someone to arrange them into a coherent picture. Terror doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it operates in the spaces between attention and oversight, in the gaps where systems fail to communicate, in the moments when vigilance gives way to routine. And that understanding, more than any individual name or date, became the true legacy. A reminder that protection requires more than laws and courts. It requires connection, coordination, and a collective commitment to never look away. The case closed. But the lessons remain open, studied by each new generation of investigators who understand that the cost of inattention is measured not in abstract statistics, but in empty chairs at family tables, in children who never grew old, in communities that learned too late what silence can conceal. There are names that become inseparable from the darkest chapters of history, names that carry the weight of unspeakable loss. Names that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in. Anatoly Onoprienko is one of those names. Throughout the 1990s, as Ukraine struggled to find its footing in the aftermath of Soviet collapse, as institutions crumbled and communication systems failed, as communities found themselves more isolated than they'd been in generations, he moved through the countryside like a storm cloud that no one saw coming. 52 lives ended. 52 futures erased, 52 seats at family tables that would remain forever empty. But here's what made this case burn itself into the collective memory of an entire nation. It wasn't just individuals who disappeared, it was entire family units. Grandparents who had survived wars and famines, only to fall in their own homes. Parents who had dreams for their children's futures. Children who never got the chance to discover who they might become. In some villages, entire bloodlines simply ceased to exist. Family trees severed at the root. Photo albums that would never have new pictures added. Holiday traditions that died because there was no one left to carry them forward. What's perhaps most unsettling is how unremarkable he appeared to those around him. Here's a detail that still troubles investigators. People who encountered Onoprienko during those years described him as forgettable, not menacing, not obviously troubled. Just another face in the crowd, another person passing through, another stranger who didn't warrant a second glance. Evil, it turns out, doesn't always wear a mask of obvious malevolence. Sometimes it wears the mask of normalcy so convincingly that it walks among us undetected, exploiting our assumption that danger announces itself clearly. The case revealed something profoundly disturbing about human nature and social systems. It showed how fragile our safety truly is when the structures meant to protect us break down, how quickly chaos can fill the vacuum left by failing institutions, how vulnerable we become when communication fails and communities operate in isolation. But it also revealed something else, something that keeps criminologists and psychologists awake at night: the sheer number of missed opportunities. Witnesses who reported suspicious activity but whose reports never made it beyond local offices. Evidence that sat unexamined. Patterns that existed but remained unrecognized because no one was looking at the bigger picture. One investigator, years after the case closed, admitted in an interview that what haunted him most wasn't the crime scenes he'd processed. It was the realization of how many moments existed when intervention was possible. How many times the trajectory could have been altered if only the right pieces of information had reached the right people at the right time? This is the question that lingers, the one that refuses to be neatly answered or filed away. How many warning signs were there? How many chances did the system have to connect disparate incidents into a coherent pattern? How many lives might have been saved if communication had been clearer, if resources had been better allocated, if the chaos of that transitional period hadn't created so many blind spots? The uncomfortable truth is that monsters don't just appear fully formed. They operate in the spaces we're not watching. They exploit the moments when our attention falters. They thrive in the gaps between vigilance and exhaustion, between intention and execution, between what we mean to do and what we actually accomplish. Understanding these cases isn't about dwelling in darkness for its own sake. It's about illumination. It's about learning to recognize the patterns that precede tragedy. It's about building systems resilient enough to catch what individual humans might miss. It's about refusing to let these stories fade into comfortable forgetting, because memory serves a purpose. It keeps us vigilant. It reminds us that safety isn't automatic, that protection requires constant attention, that the price of looking away can be measured in empty homes and shattered communities. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about the fragility of the structures we trust to keep us safe, then share it. Talk about it. Let it spark conversations about how we build better systems, how we watch out for one another, how we ensure that the warning signs are never again scattered across unconnected desks in different offices. Subscribe to this channel if you believe these stories deserve to be told, that the victims deserve to be remembered, that the lessons learned should never be forgotten. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because these conversations matter. They keep us thinking. They keep us questioning. They keep us from becoming complacent. The past cannot be changed. The 52 lives cannot be restored. The families cannot be made whole. But the future remains unwritten. And in that unwritten future lies our responsibility to remember, to learn, and to build systems strong enough that such darkness cannot operate undetected again. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't the comfortable ones. They're the ones that disturb us just enough to make us pay attention, to make us demand better, to make us refuse to look away when looking away is easiest. This was one of those stories, and now it's yours to carry forward.